Okay, so I just thought I'd start off by saying, why is there so much interest in compost? And, you know, through my studies and through my just keeping an eye on the research, there's a huge research body of knowledge on compost that has been for many, many years. And, you know, most of the time the messages that we're getting are very positive about the benefits of compost. There's, I think, a place to talk about compost and organic amendment in the context of future risks, which I'll briefly mention before. There's issues with disappointments with conventional fertilizing practices, not all going according to plan. A big issue with loss of control over the fertility of the farm, which, if I get the time, I'll talk a little bit more about also. And definitely farmers are moving to the how question. So I think, you know, even your most kind of hardened conventional farmer will acknowledge that there's benefits from using compost, but most of them will say, oh, that's not for me because I can't see how I can incorporate that into my farming, what's happening here? Into my farming plan, into my normal daily management. So very much a big challenge for extension and advisors is to help farmers with that how question. How am I going to do this? Now, in terms of motivations, it's probably good to check in, and these are some of the observations and comments from farmers that I've worked with over the years. With compost, there's identification of softer soil, and actually conversely, soil's getting harder under conventional practices. Fertilizer responses, and that was really around falling fertilizer responses, you know, needing to put more urea on to get the same level of production from previous years. Dollar savings associated with better use of inputs, less pugging of soils now, this is not saying that compost is a silver bullet, and I'll come back to that in a moment and try and provide a bit of context for some of these observations. A very interesting observation at the Southwest Soils Conference a couple of years ago, we visited the farm of Reggie Davis, one of those photographs that I showed, and when asked, you know, about his observations, what has he seen? And he's probably been using compost longer than anyone else in that area. He said, my soils drain better but hold more moisture. And there was a bit of a kind of, that sounds a little bit contradictory, what does that mean? But really what it was about was soil structure improving, and particularly soil structure improving at depth. So the soils were draining better and there was a deeper rooting, improved soil structure, deeper rooting meant more access to deeper water in the soil. Compost is not a panacea for poor management practices, and in fact Tim McGlade, who I mentioned briefly, he provided a really interesting insight to me, because I think he's one of the better grazing managers around, where he identified, well, his practice is to leave a higher residual on the paddocks than most other farmers around, based on the fact that you need grass to grow grass. And he talks about his solar panels, and you know, he gave me the very nice anecdote one time. He said, if you don't like cutting your grass, if you don't like mowing your lawn at home, what you'll do is you'll cut it as short as anything, and then there's a really long interval before you have to cut it again. And of course, it's a long interval because you've basically, you know, chopped the grass to within an inch of its life, and it takes a long time to regroup, regather, and grow again. Whereas if you want a nice lush lawn, you won't cut it shorter than, you know, 2 or 3 inches, but it will grow more quickly because the capacity, the reserves, the photosynthetic capacity is preserved, so it will grow more quickly. So it stands to reason, as a farmer, if you want to grow lots of grass, you leave enough grass there for the pastures to recover more rapidly. Interestingly, we found too, there was another farmer who tried, you know, using compost and doing everything the same as his neighbours, and came back and said, oh, it's not working for me, you know, the grass just isn't growing. And when that particular case was investigated, it was observed that that farmer was grazing his paddocks down really hard. And because he was taking too much off, it was taking too long for the grass to recover. So he was forced to go back to putting his urea on to make the grass grow, simply because there wasn't enough grass left there to respond quickly following grazing. An interesting point about the dairy farmers in particular is that they said in going into compost use, they don't want to compromise production. You know, they have to pay the bills, they have to produce as much milk as they were doing before. They weren't prepared to go backwards, so they weren't prepared to grow less grass. these are some of the questions I've been grappling with. You know, like if all the news is so good, which it generally is, why is uptake so slow? So with design, as I said before, you've got to know your question, and you've got to understand, you know, does compost even have a place in the solution? You know, if your problem is that you have really poor drainage in your paddocks, you can dump, you know, hundreds of tons of compost in there, and you'll just probably create a stinking mess. It's not going to fix your problem. So be clear about what your problem is. Part of that is knowing your soil type and soil condition. You've got to try and limit the number of variables. So, you know, if you're going to say, I'm going to try some compost, but hey, I'll chuck a bit of lime on and I'll chuck a bit of super on at the same time, and you get a response, you think, okay, what is the system responding to? Is it responding to the super or the lime or the compost, or do we have a clue? So, replicating and randomizing is how we will cut through some of those questions. Landholder commitment is incredibly important. You know, as I said before, one of our, actually more than one, a number of our trials have fallen over for either landholders losing interest, changing their mind, or saying, gee, that was so good, I'm going to do it across the whole farm, and there goes your control. You've got to maintain careful records. And those careful records are empirical records, but also your observations. What have you seen change? And that might include things like animal feeding behaviour. Some of those are really insightful, and animals will respond to more palatable pastures. And you've got to come back then and interpret your results against your question. With the design of your trials and whatever else, you know, just because it's compost is not an excuse for a lack of rigour. In fact, it's a requirement for greater rigour because of the inherent variability in compost. And part of that is understanding exactly what it is you're applying. You know, there's no point kind of just getting a load of compost and throwing it on if you don't even know what's in that compost. So get your compost analysed, understand how much carbon is in that compost. You know, we've seen compost that have carbon levels in single figures. How can you have carbon levels in single figures in a truckload of compost? Seems impossible, but believe me, it happens. And we do a lot of testing in Cecil. We do a lot of testing for compost against the Australian standard 4454. And we did a recent analysis for an AORA conference, that's the Australian Organics Recycling Association. And we reported at that only 25% of commercial composts actually met the Australian standard. And that's because it's very involved. There's actually an awful lot to it. But one of the criteria is a minimum of 20% organic carbon in compost, and many fail on that score. Use empirical measures to guide your investment, and I say investment because everything you do is an investment. So test your soil as well as testing your compost. So if you're putting your, you know, you want to know what's the condition of my soil, you know, before I put the compost on. So that's part of your thinking about is adding compost actually what your soil needs. And so many people just guess. The best one was a farmer told me that, you know, when I asked him, you know, how much fertilizer he puts on, he says, well, a taxman tells me how much I should put on at the end of the year. It seems funny, but it's really quite sad. And use nutrient budgeting. So, you know, that's part of the equation. So you do your soil test, you test your compost, you know basically you know how hungry the system is, and you know you're about to feed it. So there's probably going to be a gap there, because compost is usually not enough to drive the levels of production that we require in modern agricultural systems. So you have to supplement. And that's been the success, that's been the experience of success of the farmers that have been using compost well, particularly in dairying. And in fact, we've taken their experience and extended that out to croppers and everyone else. You know, someone says, oh, you know, compost is going to save the world, I'm going to, you know, put compost everywhere and everything will be wonderful. Well, it's not, you know, because not only is compost generally low in nutrients, those nutrients are not all going to be delivered in 1 year. So, you've got to make up the gap with inorganics. And those figures that I showed before from Brendan Birmingham, he's actually supplementing to quite a high degree, which is why he's getting such high performance. But what we're finding, we don't have the empirical evidence for this yet, but certainly the indications are maintaining soil condition with compost is enhancing the efficiency of the fertilizers that you apply also. Now, if there's one kind of key message that I want you all to go home with today, it's asking yourself, it's not asking, it's building this question into your mind whenever you're going to talk about compost. So is compost a fertilizer or a soil conditioner? There is perpetual confusion about this question. You know, I've talked to so many people that say, oh, I've put out, you know, compost, and I didn't get a response. Ah, that's crap. I'm not going to do it again. And one of my earlier insights into this was I worked with a farmer who was using compost, and his early experience was he recognized his soil condition was deteriorating. He wanted to do something about it. He thought, compost, that's the answer. So he went and he put some compost on, and he looked at his crop and he went, well, that's no difference. I've wasted my money. I won't do that again. Next year, you know, planted his next rotation, whatever it was in, and a strip up the middle of the field was performing better than the rest. And he thought, that's where I put the compost last year. So it completely changed his thinking about how to anticipate improvements in compost. And this is where, you know, are we using compost as a replacement for urea? Or are we using compost because we have some fundamental problems with the condition of our soil, with low organic matter or you know, compaction, or all of those kinds of questions? We need to have some kind of mechanism to understand, you know, where the benefit is going to come from. So if we're using, I've got the word carbon here, but substitute compost, you know, compost as a soil conditioner is really about feeding the soil and feeding the soil organisms, because the soil organisms do all those jobs, and Pauline kind of talked about that before. If we want carbon or compost as a fertilizer, then we're talking about that material giving up its nutrients in a way that's going to meet the needs of the crop that you're growing, and it's going to meet the needs of the crop in a timely fashion, and enough of them to get the production that you're looking for. But of course, with compost, nutrients aren't very soluble, so nutrient budgeting in here is going to account for release over a number of years, and it's very difficult for us to say even over how many years are the nutrients going to be mineralized out of compost. You know, some elements like potassium, most of that will come through in year one from most composts, but something like phosphorus might take 3 or 5 or more years to come through, and a lot depends also on the kind of compost, how quickly it's going to give up its nutrient load. So in terms of evaluation, is the compost a fertilizer? If so, compare it against fertilizers like poultry manure or urea and whatever else, and see how it compares against those kinds of inputs. Is it a soil conditioner? If not, what do you compare it against? So you need to evaluate changes in soil condition using things like the soil health cards that Chris mentioned, or things like the VSA, the Visual Soil Assessment, which is something that the department has been running various workshops on, and is a really useful hands-on tool, so you can start to understand how your soil is changing by its look, its appearance, its smell, and all those other kind of things. So in summary, if the answer is compost, what is the question? Get really clear about the question before you set off on the compost pathway. Understand the variability that you're dealing with in compost, soils, climate, and all of the other things that are going to impact on how well it works. Access good data to design and evaluate your trial. Every decision is an investment decision. You know, your farms are businesses, so every decision that you make is going to cost you money, and you want to make sure that that decision is going to build capacity in your business and in you. And understand the language of evaluation of compost, and that relates to, you know, is it a soil conditioner, is it fertilizer, how's it going to work, what do I want it to do? That's it.